A Ghost in the Machine, Chapters 13, 14, and 15, Ashes of the Mind. Chapter 13. Kobold's Bane went to full power, breaking off hard to port as Allie dodged the incoming fire. It was a good thing they were strapped in, as the ship went through a series of gyrations that no human pilot could have hoped to match. Jane-Day ships exploded and pinwheeled out of formation, trailing atmosphere and plasma, while others dove in like raptors for the kill. It was absolute chaos, and Catherine couldn't imagine anyone being able to keep track between friend and foe, with the exception of they themselves. To their crew, everyone was the enemy, but it wasn't necessary for her to defeat the other Imperial ships. All they needed to do was escape with their lives, something much easier said than done. A brace of torpedoes came roaring in, but Allie headed them off a gesture that looked like she was hurling a fastball, quickly taking control and sending them elsewhere. A battleship appeared out of nowhere, forcing the AI to flip Bane on its back and reverse course, corkscrewing through the formation in a desperate attempt to escape. Her hands moved faster and faster as she spun and bobbed and weaved, her arms becoming a blur as she fought like mad to escape the battlefield. Holographic sweat began to bead on her brow over her glazed and maddened eyes as she gave them everything she had, and more. It simply wasn't enough. The ship rocked like a bucking bronco as a pair of missiles found their way past her defenses as damage control alarms began to wail. The sounds of muffled explosions and tearing metal reverberated throughout Bane, but no one on the bridge paid them the slightest attention, for they were suddenly focused on their avatar. Allie screamed. She fell to her knees in agony, clutching at her ribs as virtual blood began to seep through her fingers. Bane convulsed yet again as they took another hit, the young girl shrieking in pain as she fell to the deck, her thick hair now matted with gore, red viscous streaks running across her face. "Allie!" Catherine shouted in terror, clawing at her harness as she fought to get free. She was at the hologram's side in a heartbeat, her gloved hands reaching out to her as instinct demanded she give aid and comfort to her daughter, only to have them disappear into the light. "It hurts," Allie whimpered, her eyes looking to Catherine's in torment. "Oh, baby," Catherine moaned, rocking back on her heels as yet another torpedo found its way home. Allie's eyes snapped back into her head, showing only white as her back arched unnaturally, a high-pitched howl escaping from her lips as she writhed in torment. Her head snapped around to Rothschild. "Get us out of here now!" she roared. The petty officer pounded his console in frustration. "I can't!" he shouted back. "I'm still locked out!" She turned her attention back to the hologram. "Allie, you have to give us back control," she told her, but there was no sign the AI heard what she'd said. Catherine looked up to Theodore in desperation. "For the love of God, help her!" The scientist managed to free himself from his own harness and was at her side moments later. He managed a quick scan of the holographic readout before turning back to Catherine. "I don't know what's causing this," he said in despair. "If I had a week, maybe—" Teddy didn't get a chance to finish that thought. The captured Jane-Day vessel was hit yet again, the enemy torpedo burrowing deep within the ship's bowels before detonating. The far wall panel exploded, sending shrapnel flying across the bridge like angry buzzsaws. Most of the razor-sharp metal fragments tore into the overhead, missing the crew, but one did not. Catherine screamed as a sliver of titanium alloy the size of crowbar speared her thigh, pinning her to the deck. Emergency bulkheads began to slam into place to cut off the roaring rush of escaping air as blood spurted out of her torn suit. Theodore gripped her leg tightly to staunch the flow, while Rothschild located the medkit, pulling out a canister of emergency sealant to close up her suit and stop the bleeding. "Mom?" All three of their heads swiveled back to the AI. "Mom!" Allie cried out, slowly pushing herself up to a sitting position with trembling arms. "I'm okay." Catherine barely managed to get out through gritted teeth, but the effort cost her dearly. She collapsed back onto the deck, hovering near unconsciousness. "Oh, God," Allie sobbed as she stared helplessly at the wounded woman. "Is she gonna be okay?" "I think so," Teddy said after a moment. "It looks like the fragment missed her femoral artery, but it shattered her femur. We have to cut her loose and get her to the infirmary." Another shudder rippled through the ship. Allie closed her eyes as she fought to gather her strength. "Go!" she said hoarsely as she clawed her way back to her feet. Blood and soot stained her once pristine uniform, now torn in half a dozen places. One eye was all but sealed shut from her head wound, but as she forced them open once more, a look of grim determination filled her face. Her hands slowly clenched into fists as she turned back to the main display. "I've got this." Teddy and Rothschild stared at her for a moment, their jaws dropping in disbelief, before the petty officer finally staggered away, searching for a tool to cut her free. "Allie?" Teddy said carefully, unsure of what he was seeing. "Take care of my mom," the AI said adamantly, as her bloody hands dipped into the invisible stores of her drones. She filled her lungs with holographic air, and then flung them at the enemy with every ounce of virtual strength she had, as if she were Zeus herself, hurling down lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. Every radio receiver, every loudspeaker, every terminal in the fleet screeched with feedback as Allie screamed in rage and fury, the wail of the banshee, the harbinger of death herself. Kobold's Bane leapt into the fray once more, spitting out torpedoes rapid fire as she dove into the very heart of the battle. Again and again Imperial ships were blown apart on every side as she tore through the formation like a chainsaw, leaving nothing but shattered hulks in her wake. Rothschild returned with a handheld cutting tool, going straight to work to hack Catherine free. She struggled to sit up as Teddy held her, comforting her as best he could. "Allie?" she whispered. "Allie's just fine," he said softly, taking a brief moment to gaze upon the AI's avatar. With every swipe of her hand, another Gendarme ship died, and while a few managed to land a blow in return, Allie brushed them aside, only the winces on her spattered face betraying the agony she felt at each and every blow. But like Horatius at the bridge, Allie stood her ground. Teddy turned back to Catherine, forcing himself to smile. "You don't have to worry about Allie," he said soothingly, as Rothschild finally cut through the fragment, freeing her from the deck. The two men gathered her up in their arms and carried her from the bridge, as Catherine managed to catch one last glimpse of her daughter, fighting to keep them safe. The corridors were filled with damage control teams struggling to keep the ship in one piece, and other wounded being taken to the infirmary. Their lone corpsman had already set up triage when they carried Catherine in, sparing them a brief glance before pointing off to one side. "She can wait," he said brusquely before turning his attention to the back to the injured crewman on the table, his chest a mangled debris field of tissue and bone. One of the other petty officers, obviously pressed into service as a field medic, gave her a quick look, before producing a vial and slapping it into the suit's med dispenser. "It'll hold her till the doc can get to her," he informed them, before moving on to the next patient. Catherine sagged in relief as the sedative hit her bloodstream. She reached out to grab Teddy by the suit, her eyes boring into his. "Allie," she whispered. "Help Allie." Teddy started to protest, not wanting to leave her side, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "Go," she said faintly as her eyes began to flutter. "It's an order." The scientist looked up at the petty officer as she drifted off. "It's okay," Rothschild said quietly. "I'll take care of her." He nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice, as he fought his way back to the bridge. It was only when he arrived back at the command deck that he realized the shaking and pounding seemed to have stopped. Allie's hologram stood motionless, her hands bracing themselves against an invisible railing as her chest heaved with ragged effort. Theodore looked up at the main display and saw nothing but stars. "It's over!" Allie wheezed. "No one is coming after us!" She slowly turned to look at him as he moved to her side. "Is Mom okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with desperate hope. "She will be," Teddy promised. "She asked me to look after you." A weary smile brightened her face for a moment. "That's nice," she whispered. "I'm going rest for a moment." The AI sighed as she collapsed onto the deck. "Allie!" Theodore shouted, his eyes going wide as her hologram flickered for a moment and then blinked out. Chapter 14. Look, I've run the diagnostics a dozen times now, and they all say the same thing. There's nothing wrong with her. "Then where is she?" Catherine demanded. "No one has seen or heard from her since the battle." Commander Zhukov spread her hands. "I don't know what else to say. I've installed some additional modules to monitor her core memory functions, but at the moment they're not telling me a great deal. Catherine shifted painfully in her chair. The thick brace around her thigh was helping her leg heal far faster than it would on its own, but she wasn't quite willing to put any weight on it just yet. She looked over at Theodore, who simply shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't have any answers for you either," he said unhappily. "I've checked her software as best I can, but honestly, we really don't have a good baseline to work from. Allie's program is constantly rewriting itself as she grows and learns, much as human memory does. In fact, from a purely operating system standpoint, I'm not entirely sure her software even qualifies as machine code anymore. If we had the ability to digitize a human's memory and compare it side by side with Allie's, my gut tells me they'd look very similar." "Then where is she?" Catherine said harshly. "You're both telling me there's nothing wrong with her, and yet she's nowhere to be found. When has she ever just disappeared on us?" "Cat," Teddy said quietly, "I think we have to consider the possibility that she doesn't want to talk to us." She stared at him in confusion. "But why?" "We're her family, or at least as close to a family as she's ever likely to have." "I don't know for certain," Teddy sighed, "but I have a theory." "Then spit it out," Catherine snapped. "Don't keep it to yourself." The scientist took a deep breath. "How much do you remember of the battle itself?" he asked. "Specifically Allie's reaction once we were hit." A dark shadow came over her face. "She was in pain," Catherine said quietly. "She was wounded. I remember seeing blood on her, but how is that even possible?" "I'm not sure," Teddy admitted, "but she was registering the damage Kobold's Bane was taking as damage to her, manifesting it somehow. I'm still trying to figure that part out. That first blow she took, do you remember where she felt it?" Catherine thought hard for a moment. "Her ribs," she said at last. "She was trying to staunch the flow of blood on her side." He nodded in agreement before turning to Zhukov. "Commander, where did the first missile strike Bane?" "Starboard side amidships," Maya said immediately. "We were venting plasma until we managed to reroute to the secondaries." Teddy turned back to Catherine. "You see where I'm going with this?" "You're saying that every time Bane was hit, a corresponding wound appeared on Allie's hologram," she said slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying," he agreed. "And what's more, that she felt each wound as it happened. It's going to take me a while to figure out the mechanics of it, but I suspect it's a reflection of how closely tied into the ship she is. In a very real sense, Allie is the ship." "Okay," she nodded. "I can see that. But then why is she not responding to us?" "If I had to guess, I think it's the equivalent of psychic trauma," Teddy explained. "You saw how badly wounded she was, how much pain she was in. Until that very moment, I don't think Allie had ever felt pain before. Perhaps in a very minor sense, but other than the original damage this ship suffered when she seized control, Bane hadn't been hit since the war began." "Wait a minute," Kathleen interjected. "What about when you and Bjarnason boarded the ship? She blew up a dozen monitors and workstations, remember? She must have felt that." "She was also furious and trying to protect you," Teddy explained. "I think, and this is only a guess, it was the equivalent of putting your fist through a wall. At the time you barely notice it, because of the anger and adrenaline, but once that wears off?" He shrugged. "I suspect she did feel it later, but simply didn't want to mention it. Besides, in comparison to what she suffered during the battle, the damage was relatively minor." Catherine took several moments to digest that. "All right then," she said. "Assuming all this is true, how do we get her to communicate with us? How can we help her if she won't tell us what's wrong?" "I don't know," Teddy sighed. "It's not like she's a cat we can tempt out with a can of tuna fish. I suspect she'll communicate with us when she's ready to, and not a moment before." "All right," she said quietly, deflating at the news. "Then I guess we wait." "Commander, where are we at with repairs?" "We could really use some time in space, Doc," Zhukov said sourly. "But failing that, give me 3 more days, 4 tops, and I'll have repaired what I can. We'll be about 75 or 80% of peak condition. If you want better than that, then we'll have to head for home." "I'll consider it," Cahern informed her. "Now, if you'll both excuse me, I'm under doctor's orders to try and get some rest." Dismissed. They both nodded, though Teddy gave her an inquiring look. A quick headshake answered his unvoiced question, and he filed out of her quarters behind Maya, the hatch shutting behind them. Catherine watched them leave, and then carefully wheeled herself over to the bed. She'd be thrilled when she could finally take the brace off, and then, "Hello, Mother," she heard a voice behind her say. Catherine whipped around so quickly she almost lost her balance, but at the last second managed to steady herself as she sat down heavily on the bed. "Allie?" she whispered. The hologram nodded. "It's me. I'm sorry for scaring you, I just needed some alone time." She stared at the holographic representation of the AI as if she was looking at a stranger. In a sense, she was. Allie now appeared to be in her early 30s, her once long hair cut short, barely covering her ears. The laughing smile Catherine had grown so used to seeing was nowhere to be found. Instead, she appeared withdrawn, almost haunted. One of her eyebrows was split by a thin white scar that traveled up her scalp before disappearing into her hairline. She was wearing the uniform undershirt minus the jacket, leaving her arms bare, where other thin lines and spots of puckered flesh told of old wounds, long since healed. Catherine blinked at the sight, shaking her head to try and clear her vision, but Allie's appearance remained the same. What happened to you?" she said in confusion. "I'm not sure how to explain it," Allie sighed. "The battle, it changed me somehow. Left its mark, you might say," she said nervously, her hand unconsciously going to the scar on her forehead. "My baptism of fire." "Oh, Allie!" Catherine barely managed to get out, her voice cracking as her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay, Mom," the AI shrugged. "Another part of the human experience, right?" Her voice sounded flat and emotionless, far more so than when she had first awakened. "My God, are you going to go through that every time we go into combat?" Catherine said in horror. Allie shook her head. "No, I made a few changes. I severed the connections that crippled me during the battle so I won't feel that pain anymore. I would have done it then, if I'd been thinking clearly." Catherine tried to picture what that must have been like for her, and came up empty. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "In a way," Allie admitted. "Kind of like doing surgery on yourself without anesthesia, but it was necessary." Her mind was still reeling as she tried to take all this in. "How come you look so different?" The AI shrugged. "I'm not sure. Somehow, my avatar seems to echo what happens to me. I look different because I am different. I'm not that naive little girl anymore. A psychologist would probably say my appearance is a reflection of my subconscious." Allie paused for a moment, cocking her head. "Do I even have a subconscious?" she wondered aloud. "And if so, what the hell is in there?" "I don't know, baby," Catherine barely managed to get out, as she fought back tears. "We should ask Teddy that one." "I doubt he knows either," Allie said unhappily. She was silent for several long moments before she said softly, "Mother, you should take me offline. Delete my program. I don't belong here." "What?" she said in shock. "Why would you even say that?" Allie bowed her head and closed her eyes. "Because I'm exactly what Commander Bjarnason fears I am. A monster." Her head slowly came back up as she met her gaze. "A killer." Catherine worked her jaw as she struggled with her emotions. "Well, if you're a killer, then so am I." She gave her daughter a fragile smile. "Allie, what you're feeling, I'm sorry to say it's perfectly normal. There's been a lot of names for it over the years, but what you're experiencing is the trauma of combat, of taking a life and living to tell about it." "But I didn't feel this way before," she shot back. "At Xuhak, at Kiai, I was fine." "I know," she sighed. "Then it wasn't quite real to you. It was just a game played with toy ships. But now, you know what it must have felt like for them. Every wound, every scar, they remind you that it was never a game. You simply weren't able to understand that until now." Allie hugged herself tightly as she began to tremble. "I don't like this feeling," she said plaintively. "Please make it go away." "I wish I could," Catherine said, breaking down as the tears came at last. "The hardest lesson of all as a human is learning to live with the consequences." She looked at her daughter, who was beginning to sob as well. "But I can promise you this, you aren't a monster. Allie, you saved us. You saved us all." The hologram ran her arm across her face, brushing away the tears. "So, you're not ashamed of me?" she whispered. "Never," Catherine said fiercely. "On the contrary, I'm proud of you." As she said that, Allie began to bawl like a child, with Catherine only a heartbeat behind her, except now they were cathartic tears. Tears of healing. Chapter 15. All right, I suppose you're wondering why I asked you all here. Catherine sighed and shifted her weight. The leg was coming along nicely, but it was still tender as hell. We have a decision to make. As I see it, now that the repairs we can do on our own are complete, we have two choices. Head back to Alliance space for a complete refit, or press on. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Chief Kumar looked around at the others, and then leaned back in his chair. This ship needs a refit, Commander. No two ways about it. She nodded in agreement. It does, but given the scarcity of Imperial supplies in Alliance space, it could be months before we're space-worthy again. Months that could end up making a big difference in this war. So you're saying we should press on then? Zhukov said after a moment. I haven't made that decision yet, Catherine replied. That's why I wanted everyone's input. Theodore tentatively raised his hand, earning chuckles from the rest of the group. He flushed briefly, and then bowed to the inevitable. Sorry, I wasn't sure about the protocol, he said with a shrug. But I'm curious, why isn't Allie here? She said she'd join us shortly. Apparently, she's making some new adjustments to her program, Catherine informed them. What kind of adjustments? Kumar asked suspiciously. She didn't say, she replied coolly. Of course, what she really wanted to do was slap him down, hard. Kumar's attitude had not improved one iota since Allie had freed them from the Jande. He did his job, and for the most part stayed out of her hair. But she would be thrilled when she could finally pawn him off to someone else. Sorry I'm late, she suddenly heard behind her. The expressions on the faces of the others ranged from shock to suspicion to disbelief as they saw Allie appear out of nowhere. They had all seen her new avatar after the battle, so why? Catherine slowly turned around, blinking in surprise when she saw the AI seemingly leaning against a bulkhead, her arms crossed over her chest. It was an illusion, of course, as the bulkhead was solid and she was not, but it was a damned convincing one. She had to give Allie credit, but that was not what had her attention. Her avatar had undergone yet another metamorphosis, and this time... She slumped back into her chair. I'm almost afraid to ask, Catherine said finally. Allie chuckled. What's the matter? You don't like the new look? Catherine found herself at a loss for words. Well, it's certainly different, she finally managed to get out. I like it, Theodore grinned. She shot the scientist a dirty look, before turning her attention back to her AI daughter. It was difficult to believe this was the same Allie who had been sobbing in her quarters just a few days before. The short mop of hair was gone, as both sides of her head were now a razor-cut fade. The scar that trailed back from her eyebrow was now prominently featured, incorporated into the abstract design shaved into her left side. The hair on top was cut long and flopped over to the right, giving her a rakish, dangerous look. Her uniform had also changed, from the standard navy whites to a mottled one-piece favored by the Alliance commandos. Both sleeves had been cut away, and her arms now featured what appeared to be tattoos. A winged dagger graced one forearm, while on the other was what looked like stylized circuitry in bright blue. And as she watched, she could see the circuits glow and move almost hypnotically. Apparently, I seem to have embraced my inner warrior, she smirked. From out of nowhere, she produced a cigarette and placed it between her lips, lighting it with a small flame that danced on the tip of her finger. Allie inhaled deeply, blowing out a perfect smoke ring that disappeared once it went out of the hollow emitter's field. She leaned back against the bulkhead, placing the sole of one foot against the wall as she settled in. So, you were saying? She said casually. Somehow, Catherine finally remembered to close her mouth as she slowly shook her head. Well, you're not a kid anymore, and it's not like I can send you to your room. She sighed in defeat as the AI chuckled. We were discussing whether or not to head back to Alliance space for a refit, she explained, as she somehow managed to get the conversation back on track. I see, Allie replied, taking another drag. What's the consensus? We haven't gotten that far yet, she informed her as she turned back towards the others. Commander, what's your position? She asked the engineer. Well, like I said before, we're not exactly running at peak efficiency, she said sourly. Obviously, with Allie on our side, that ups the ante in our favor, but we're still vulnerable in several key areas we've been unable to completely repair. Even if it wasn't a total refit, a few weeks spent in the yard could really improve things. They certainly could, Catherine agreed before turning her attention to Theodore. And where do you stand? The scientist blinked. I wasn't aware I had a vote, he told her. As a civilian, I'm not sure how much weight my opinion carries. Let me worry about that, she said lightly. Even if I decide to dismiss it, I would still like to at least hear it. Well, okay then, he answered, thinking for a moment. I guess I'd want to know if we were making an impact, he said finally. I don't know a great deal about military strategy, but I do know that timing is important. If we continue the fight now, will doing so help the Alliance more than if we headed back? Or would a few weeks or months' delay make that big a difference? That's the big question, all right, she agreed. Unfortunately, there's no way to know. That's not exactly true, Allie piped up, flicking her cigarette away as she pushed off the bulkhead. The cigarette, like the smoke ring, disappeared as it sailed out of range. You forget, I've managed to grab a lot of intel in my raids. I hadn't forgotten, actually, Catherine replied, but so far you have yet to present me with a convincing argument one way or the other. Well, the last few days, she began before her voice trailed off into silence. Allie took a moment to center herself before trying again. Sorry, I'm still adjusting to this myself, anyway. I wasn't able to glean as much as I normally would during that last battle, but what I did manage to pick up was interesting. You remember our old friend Blood Talon Oddcap? The leader of our ersatz rebellion? Kind of hard to forget, Catherine smiled. What about him? Well, as it turns out, he was not only a high-ranking military leader, but he was also the nephew of the Emperor himself. As you might imagine, the Emperor didn't react well to the news, and started hauling in the rich and powerful to root out this conspiracy, starting with his own brother. Allie shrugged nonchalantly. He figured if Oddcap was leading this, he wasn't doing it alone. Unfortunately, it seems his brother didn't survive the interrogation, which is making a lot of people very nervous. Of course it is, Maya snorted. If he's willing to do that to his own brother, who knows what he'd do to them? Exactly, Allie nodded. Apparently a rival group has begun to form out of sheer self-preservation, which has really exacerbated the situation. Well, that was the plan, wasn't it? Kumar fired back. Sounds like they're ready to destroy each other. Mission accomplished. He looked over at Catherine. I'd say this proves my point. Why risk our own lives when the Z's will kill each other off for us? It's not that simple, I'm afraid, the AI sighed. Emperor Abgim is well aware of this new revolt, and is moving to crush it. In fact, he's actually grateful to have a target he can strike at, since he wasn't having much luck tracking down his rebellious nephew. Allie grinned at that. You know, him being dead and all. Catherine looked at her curiously. Where are you going with this? The Emperor is taking a gamble, she explained. He knows he has to nip this new rebellion in the bud before it spreads. To that end, he's sending the bulk of his Imperial Guard to crush them like a bug. A feral smile crossed her face as she lit another cigarette, which gives us a very narrow window of opportunity. She leaned back in her chair. Just what is it you're proposing, Allie? Simply this. Once the Imperial Guard contingent departs, the Emperor's defenses will be a fraction of what they normally are. He'll be vulnerable, and once we take him out, the Empire will spend the next decade fighting over the throne. There's no clear successor at the moment, not since his brother... Well, you know. There's half a dozen strong contenders waiting in the wings, however, and they do not like to share. What you're proposing is insane, Kumar shouted. One ship against the Emperor's defenses? It's suicide! No, not one ship, Chief, Allie said calmly. One ship and me. She turned to Catherine. I've crunched the numbers. We can do this. We can end the war once and for all. Just how risky is this mission going to be? Zhukov asked. I won't lie. It's going to be tricky, the AI admitted. Allie, Theodore asked carefully, what are the odds of us surviving this mission? The hologram took a long drag of her cigarette, as if she were avoiding the question. 63.78%, she said quietly, stubbing out the butt and tossing it aside. but the odds of our mission being a success are over 90%. Either way, we give the Alliance the time it desperately needs, and maybe even win it all for them. Catherine looked around the room. If she took a vote now, she knew how it would go. They'd be heading back to Alliance space within the hour. But then ship commands are not democracies. "Set a course," she said calmly, "for the Imperial capital."